There is a violence in being seen. There's a silent, invisible cruelty when the female body exists as a spectacle. What happens when a woman's body stops being her own? When perfection isn't a personal goal, but a performance demanded by a gaze that she can never hope to escape? In Darren Aronofsky's Black Swan and Coralie Faja's The Substance, two women chase an unachievable, internalized ideal of perfection. Black Swan's Nina Sayers is a psychologically fragile ballerina who's consumed by her desire to embody discipline and perfection. Under this pressure, Nina's reality slowly begins to crumble. After landing the coveted lead role in Swan Lake, Nina becomes obsessive, paranoid, and her real and fictional worlds begin to blur into one. Her story is one of the horror and violence of feminine performance, and completely losing oneself to perfection. The Substance's Elizabeth Sparkle is an aging celebrity who's fired from her television role as an aerobics instructor the moment she turns 50, discarded by a culture obsessed with beauty, youth, and flawlessness. Desperate to reclaim her status, she turns to a mysterious substance which promises to restore her to her former glory. The substance creates a copy in her image, one of youth and perfection. But what follows is a spine-chilling, gory body horror descent into violence and jealousy. This video essay explores how Black Swan and The Substance reveal the brutality of the male gaze and capitalist commodification, and how the impossible-to-reach standard of perfection haunts the female psyche. On a material level, both Black Swan and The Substance portray the horror of the commodification of the female body. From a Marxist lens, the pursuit of perfection is the pursuit of a marketable product, a commodity to be bought, sold, and consumed by others. When the body ceases to hold exchange value in a neoliberal society, it's discarded. In Black Swan, Nina's skill is a commodity. Her value is tied to her ability to dance perfectly, and her ability to embody a role and be molded by her director. Nina is not her own subject, but a vessel for a performance created for the generation of profit, either in the form of ticket sales or prestige. Beth McIntyre, a former prima ballerina who is discarded after she ages and no longer serves the company's interests, is Nina's constant reminder of this. This constant awareness of her disposability alienates Nina from her body and her sense of self. She's no longer simply Nina, but a slave to the ballet machine. The Substance offers an even more literal critique. Elizabeth's body is a product which has aged past its shelf life and is discarded the minute it is deemed no longer palatable to the masses. Upon her consumption of the Substance, a younger, more marketable version of herself is created, one which is granted the opportunity to enter the market based on her perceived perfection and desirability. But this new, perfectly engineered body, Sue, is not actually hers to control. Sue belongs to the cultural machine that produced her. Elizabeth's doubling reveals how women's bodies are infinitely replaceable products, rendering their true selves and their identities irrelevant as their worth is extracted directly from the physical. Under capitalism, a woman's worth is determined solely by her body's ability to conform to the standards of perfection and desirability. Both films touch on how capitalism not only commodifies labor, but also skill, bodies, and appearances. The violence suffered by Nina and Elizabeth is not an isolated or random occurrence. It's systemic. It's born out of the capitalistic drive to extract value and to discard waste. Youth, beauty, perfection are commodities with expiration dates. These women aren't discarded and destroyed because of anything inherently wrong with them, or any inherent worthlessness or inability, but because they exist within a system that is designed to consume them. The cruelty of constant visibility does not only come from the knowledge that you're constantly being watched, but the way you learn to observe yourself through the eyes of others. Feminist film theorist Laura Mulvey writes about how the male gaze positions women in cinema as objects to be looked at, objectifying and sexualizing them for male pleasure, rather than framing them as independent agents. But the horror deepens when the gaze is no longer just external. It is here that we find an interesting intersection between Mulvey's male gaze and French post-structuralist Michel Foucault's panopticon. The panopticon is a circular prison design where a watchman is able to observe every prisoner without them being aware when they're being watched. The brilliance and horror of the panopticon lies in this uncertainty. Prisoners, aware of the potential of being watched, begin to regulate their own behavior, no longer needing direct instruction and punishment to obey. The prisoner has internalized the gaze, which means that they now discipline themselves. Foucault uses the panopticon as a metaphor to describe the ways in which norms and invisible systems of power govern, discipline, and regulate bodies and minds. In both movies, the female characters become their own wardens, internalizing the gaze and policing themselves and their performances accordingly. Nina lives under constant and suffocating observation from her mother and her director. She performs for her director, who manipulates her through a combination of praise and degradation, leaving her in an endless loop of fragile striving. She performs for her controlling mother, a former ballerina whose failed aspirations have made Nina's perfection her only salvation. And perhaps most devastatingly, she performs for an invisible audience. She performs for a faceless, omnipresent gaze that exists not only in front of the stage, but in her psyche. For Nina, perfection is a desperate, self-destructive performance for others, rather than a personal goal or aspiration. Elizabeth's ever-present audience is a culture that values aesthetics, youth, and desirability over everything else. As a TV star, her image is her currency, and her worth is ultimately dependent upon her appearance. When the aging process begins to unravel her image, she is discarded. So she resorts to taking the substance in an attempt to regain control and reclaim the patriarchal beauty she once possessed. Through her copy, Sue, Elizabeth performs perfection once again, for a world that has decided that without this beauty and perfection, she's obsolete. In post-structuralist philosophy, the idea of a stable, coherent, and static self is an illusion. Thinkers such as Foucault and Julia Kristeva and Judith Butler argue that there is no such thing as a fixed and innate essence. Rather, identity is shaped and constructed through socio-cultural contexts, discourse, and, in the case of Foucault, power. The characters of Nina and Elizabeth display this instability, with the motif of doubling showing the women losing their grasp of a unified sense of self under the never-ending pressure of perfection. Nina exists in a constant state of fracture. Emotionally, she has split herself in two. On the one hand, she is the virginal white swan, and on the other hand, she is the sensual, dark black swan. Psychologically, she exists in two different realms: reality, where she's a dancer in the ballet, and the fictional universe in which the ballet takes place. These selves are not neatly separated. They bleed into one another, with the lines between them blurring more and more as she sinks into a psychosis, trying to reconcile them. Rather than simply reflecting true reality, mirrors become portals, and Nina hallucinates each of her fragmented selves. She falls apart as she becomes unable to distinguish between herself and others, the real and the fictional, performance and personhood. Elizabeth's fragmentation is less metaphorical, as she is quite literally splitting into two. Her younger double, created by this substance, embodies patriarchal flawlessness. Sue embodies what she no longer can. She is an embodied manifestation of the culture's obsession with youth and beauty. Elizabeth becomes severed from her own subjectivity, with her body becoming a battleground where her identity crumbles under the weight of expectation. The grotesqueness lies not only in her physical split, but in the realization that her perfected self was never truly hers, but the culture's. When the body becomes a site of performance and control, it ceases to be a private vessel. And out of this emerges violence. Violence of the self against the self, and violence of the self against the system that demands this perfection. In both movies, body horror makes visible the invisible violence of the systems that demand the performance of perfection, and the violence of one's body no longer belonging to oneself. Nina's body exists in a war for control. Her body, and the striving for its perfection, falls under the control of her mother, her director, and her ballet company. Her body begins to betray her as the pressure to embody both the black and the white swan perfectly intensifies. She hallucinates feathers breaking through her skin, she scratches herself raw in her sleep, and she picks away at her skin as if she's trying to peel away the physical parts of her that don't conform. Her actions could be seen as a symptom of her madness, but they can also be seen as acts of rebellion and desperation. These acts of self-harm may be the only means to exercise control over a body that others have claimed. Aronofsky uses these bodily disruptions to visualize the violence of the demand for feminine perfection. The film's harrowing climax sees Nina's complete physical transformation into the Black Swan. And this transformation is both a triumph and a tragedy, as Nina has finally achieved perfection, but only by destroying herself in the process. The Substance takes this metaphor to the corporeal realm. Elizabeth's body is not simply controlled and self-disciplined, but fully split, actually dismembered and replicated. Images of shattered bones, melting flesh, bodies being split open and torn apart, makes literal the horror of a culture that rips into and discards the bodies of women when they're no longer catering to the gaze. Elizabeth's body is mutilated, not only by others but by herself. She is an active participant in her own undoing as she desperately attempts to reclaim the power she never truly had as a woman in show business. Through the spectacle of mutilated or transformed bodies, horror becomes the language that communicates this psychological and physical cruelty of objectification. There is a horror in the realization that this violence is ordinary, living unnoticed in cosmetic adverts, mirrors, audition rooms, and everyday beauty standards. These films both show how the pursuit of conformity to patriarchal standards of perfection is an act of socially sanctioned self-torment, which, in the cases of Nina and Elizabeth, ultimately leads to death. Though separated by time and fictional landscapes, both films portray women who are devoured by the same predator: the commodification of the body, the gaze, and the endless demand to remain perfect. Perfection isn't just a goal, it's a life sentence, and it turns the body into a combat zone or a theatre where women are trapped in a performance that they did not choreograph. Under this relentless gaze of capitalism, patriarchy, and culture, bodies rebel, and we become participants in our own torture. Through gruesome and grotesque body horror and psychological terror, these films explore the structural violence of what it means to be a woman in this neoliberal patriarchal society. These systems, which compel the feminine psyche to perform its own undoing, leave no survivors. To be a woman is to be a commodity, a spectacle, and ultimately a ghost.